So you just learned how to play chess. You know all the rules of the game, you understand the basic concept of how to checkmate your opponent's king, and now you want to learn some strategy. Well, a great place to start is at the beginning of the game, the opening. What are the first moves you should be making? The first lesson I'm going to give you is don't play like this. Let's say you have the white pieces here, and you want to move your rooks to the center of the board. This is bad. For some reason, a lot of players who have had zero chess instruction and only know how to move the pieces tend to want to put their rooks in the front. But if you think of chess like warfare, this would be the equivalent of putting some of your most high-ranking, valuable officers on the front lines in front of all your foot soldiers. Your foot soldiers being the pawns, and the rooks being your high-ranking officers, being the most valuable pieces you have besides your king and your queen. Don't do that, it just makes them vulnerable to attack. You want to keep your most valuable pieces toward the back until later in the game. Okay, next thing you should learn, what is the scholar's mate? This is the most likely way for a beginner to lose the game within the first few moves of the game. So you need to be aware of it, and you might consider using it against your opponent if they're a very weak player and have not been playing very long. So it goes something like this. Let's say you're going to try to use the scholar's mate on your opponent with the white pieces. You're going to move this pawn out in front of your king. Let's say your opponent does the same. Now, you're going to place your bishop on this diagonal, aiming at that pawn right there to the right of your opponent's king. That's the pawn you're going to target. Let's say your opponent makes some other move. Now you're going to target that pawn again with your queen. Now you've got your bishop and your queen targeting that pawn. If your opponent does not add protection to that pawn, let's say they make some move like this, you can take that pawn with your queen. This is checkmate. The king cannot take the queen's defended by the bishop, and the king has no squares. You can't go this way because the queen will just kill you. Now if your opponent had added protection to that pawn, let's say they had made some move like this, instead of moving this pawn, now it's not going to work. Because you take with the queen takes you, bishop takes, king takes like that. So you need to target that pawn with two pieces, your bishop and your queen, and your opponent can only have the king defending that pawn. But you need to know that the scholar's mate is easily preventable. At this point here, when you had moved your bishop out but not your queen, all your opponent would have to do is put the knight here. Now you can't target this pawn with your queen anymore. You try to go to this square, well, the knight's guarding that square. You'll just lose your queen. Also, this other square, which people often like to move their queen to target that pawn, is not working anymore because the knight is blocking the queen's access to that pawn. So you need to be aware that the scholar's mate is easily preventable, which will come in handy if your opponent tries to do the scholar's mate on you. Let's take a look at that. Let's say you move your pawn out in front of your king, they do the same. Now let's say you go here and they get their bishop in position. You can do that with your knight. Let's say you forget about it though. Let's say you make this move here and now they get their queen out to here. It's not too late. In this case, you can just simply play this move here, attacking the queen and blocking that diagonal. If you make this move though, you got to be careful, because if this pawn is not defended adequately, let's say this pawn was not defending it and this knight wasn't here, this is a common tactic in the opening. The queen could take that pawn with check, and after your king moves, grab your rook. That's very common when this pawn has been moved. In this case, it's fine because this pawn is adequately defended, but moving the pawn here is not the only way to defend against scholar's mate. You know, you could defend this pawn with the queen, so just be aware that you need more than your king defending this pawn if your opponent targets it with two pieces, the queen and the bishop in this case. But if you want to play the best way possible in the opening, you're not going to go for the scholar's mate, because the scholar's mate is easily preventable, and it involves moving your queen out early in the game. And like we said before, it's best to keep your most valuable pieces in the back until later in the game. It's usually not the best to move your queen out early. There are exceptions, but most of the time you want to keep your queen in the back until later. So now that we've covered these substandard openings, let's get to what you're really here for. What are the best opening moves you can make at the beginning of a chess game? When you're making your initial moves of the game, there's 3 opening principles you need to keep in mind. First, control the center. The center is the most important part of the board. As you can see, if there's a knight in the center, it has a whole bunch of possible squares it can jump to, as opposed to in the corner, it's only got 2 squares. So pieces are more mobile in the center and they'll have more attacking opportunities later. So the center is of utmost importance. Secondly, develop your pieces off of their original squares. By pieces, I mean everything that is not a pawn. So you're going to want to move your knights, bishops, queen, and rooks, typically in that order, and preferably to squares where they exert more central control. Thirdly, you want to castle your king as soon as possible most of the time. The king is going to be a lot safer tucked away in the corner of the board after you castle than if you leave it in the center. Do not leave your king in the center. There are a few openings where you can get away with that, but for a beginner, castle your king. Okay, so let's look at these 3 principles in action. If you had the white pieces and your opponent didn't do anything to challenge your plans and just let you put your pieces wherever you wanted to, then your ideal setup would look something like this. First, you'd want to take control in the center. The 2 most popular first moves of the game for white are to either move this pawn 2 squares out in front of your king or the queen pawn 2 squares like so. These are dual purpose moves. Let's look at this move here. It controls the center with the pawn, attacking the central square. It opens a diagonal for this bishop. We want to move these pieces out as quickly as we can. Now if your opponent allows you to, you can move your second most central pawn to the center, moving it 2 squares. This is known as an ideal pawn center. Having these 2 central pawns, the pawn in front of your king and queen, moved out 2 squares. It exerts a maximum amount of central control and it opens up diagonals for both of your bishops. Most of the time your opponent won't let you get away with establishing these pawns permanently like this, but if you're playing a beginner, they might. Now that you've taken some central control, you've opened diagonals for the bishops, the next thing you would want to do is start developing your pieces towards the center. Knights are typically better to develop before bishops, all else being equal. The reason is that the ideal squares for the knights are more obvious. This square for this knight and this square for this knight. Now in some openings, it's better to move them to this square for that knight or to this square, depending on what your opponent does. But if your opponent's just letting you have your way and placing your pieces on ideal squares, that's where you want to put your knights. So put this knight here. Bishops will typically come next. So you would put a bishop here and get ready to castle. Remember, you want to castle as soon as you can. Now, castling on the king side is known to be slightly safer than castling on the queen side. The reason is the king is further into the corner of the board, almost in the very corner. When you castle a queen side, your king ends up on this square. So it's not quite as safe, but there are openings where it's better to castle on the queen side. All of these rules have exceptions. That's one thing you have to remember. This is just very generalized, so you can get an idea of how to develop your pieces. Okay, after you're safely castled, it's good to finish moving out the rest of your pieces. Bishops and knights are typically first, and then your queen most commonly is moved to one of these squares, connecting your rooks. That means your rooks are in contact with each other. The next thing you would do is to move your rooks to the center. This is kind of your ideal setup right here. You notice that your most valuable pieces are towards the back, but they are influencing central control. The rooks are looking at the center, even if through other pieces. If these pieces move out of the way at some point, the rooks could become active and play a role in the center. Now, if any pawns have been traded, it might be better to move the rook to a file that is cleared of all your pawns. A file is just a vertical column of squares. This is a file. Now, if this pawn was not here, if it had been traded off, then it could be good to put a rook here, and now it has a route by which to attack later on. So oftentimes that'll be an even better square for the rook than a square like this where it's controlling the absolute center of the board. So once your knights, bishops, rooks, and queen have all been moved off of their original squares and your king is safely castled, at this point your opening development is complete. Opening development is just the initial movement of the pieces from the original squares and the castling of the king, and now these pieces are all positioned to attack in what's known as the middle game, which comes after the opening. Now there's one more opening principle that I need to mention, and that is time. You need to accomplish all your opening goals as quickly as possible, which is why you will often hear the advice, do not move the same piece twice in the opening. Let's say you moved your bishop here, and then on your very next move, you moved it here. Well, now you've taken 2 moves to move your bishop out, when you could have moved your bishop out to a good square in just one move, and then on your next move, you could have moved this bishop out. The player who gets their pieces developed to good squares first is going to have the first attacking chances, and generally speaking, will have the advantage. The same principle applies to moving too many pawns in the opening. They say don't move too many pawns. If you can establish these 2 pawns in the center, that's almost always a good thing. Sometimes you can move a third pawn with more central control, but if you just start making a whole bunch of pawn moves, let's say you play a pawn move like this, it doesn't really do anything. It doesn't control the center, it doesn't facilitate getting your pieces developed in any way, or castling. So it's probably not going to be a good move very early in the game. It's just kind of a waste of time. Now keep in mind that all of these opening principles I'm telling you, every rule has an exception. There are some openings where you will want to keep your king in the center. There are some openings where it's good to move maybe 3, 4 pawns in the opening. It all depends on what your opponent does. So these are just very general opening principles to keep you from getting into too much trouble early in the game. Now this is a good example of where to put your pieces if your opponent does nothing. I've inputted no moves for the opponent. If the player who's controlling the black pieces knows what they're doing though, they're going to do something to thwart you from getting this ideal setup. And you'll have to make some kind of a concession. Maybe you won't get these 2 pawns in the center. Maybe you'll have to develop a knight to here instead of to its ideal square. Every opening is different, but every opening is a fight to see who can get their pieces positioned most ideally for the middle game battle that will ensue. Now let's look at a real opening where black is actually making moves to try to counter what white is doing while setting up his own pieces in an ideal fashion. We'll look at the opening that begins with d4. Taking control in the center, opening a diagonal for a bishop. Here white has achieved 50% of the ideal pawn setup and will play e4 if black allows it. Black does not allow it. Black plays knight f6. Now if e4 is played, the knight just takes the pawn for free. So white does the next best thing, c4, controlling this central square. Now black plays e6, preparing the next move, d5, taking control in the center. If black were to play that move right away, it's not great because white will trade this less central pawn for a more central pawn. If black recaptures with the knight, white can play e4 with an attack on the knight, getting the ideal pawn setup. If black were to recapture with the queen, as we said before, it's not ideal to move your queen out early. White can develop a piece with an attack on the black queen, which will have to move a second time to get out of danger. So black decides to play e6. White plays knight f3, putting the knight on an ideal square. Now d5. This time, if white is to take on d5, black will simply recapture with the pawn, maintaining a pawn in the center. So this is a better recapture. But white doesn't do that. White plays knight c3, increasing the pressure on the central pawn, developing the knight to the ideal square. Here black decides to develop the bishop to e7 in preparation for castling. Now you might think, why not bishop d6? This controls a central square after all. However, it blocks the queen's view of the center, so that white can play bishop g5, and now this pawn is lacking protection. Since this knight is now pinned, it can't defend on d5 because if it moves, black will lose his queen. So if black were to just castle here, then there's pawn takes d5, and then black recaptures, and then the knight can take on d5. Since this knight cannot take, or as I said, the queen will be lost. So that's why black chooses to put the bishop on e7 to maintain the view of the center. Now what about d takes c4 instead? This is not good because it will allow white to play e4, getting the ideal pawn setup. If this pawn was still here, white would lose a pawn if this pawn was still here. But since it's over here, white gets the ideal pawn setup. This pawn is defended by this knight, and now this pawn on c4 is under attack by the bishop. So white is going to get that pawn back. There's not a great way to defend that pawn. If you try b5, first white will move this pawn so that there's no danger of this knight capturing it, because white wants to capture this pawn. So you can move the pawn to here with an attack on the knight. Once the knight moves, now white can take this pawn here, regaining the pawn, and still has the threat of taking this pawn here on c4. So that's not a good road for black to go down. Black plays this bishop e7 move. Now white develops the bishop to f4, hitting a central square. Black castles. White plays e3, preparing to move this bishop and castle. Here black develops his knight to the d7 square. Knight to c6 would have been a more ideal square for the knight. However, it would block this pawn. Black wants to use that pawn to strike in the center. So after knight b to d7, white develops the bishop to d3, getting ready to castle. Black plays c5, mirroring white's pawn structure. White castles. Black captures on d4. White recaptures with the pawn. And now here, black gives up his most central pawn for one of white's less central pawns, the c4 pawn. But it's worth it here, because after white takes the pawn with the bishop, the pawn structure has transformed. White now has this weak, isolated pawn. An isolated pawn is one which can never be defended by another pawn. You see, all these pawns can defend each other as they move forward, but since there's no pawns left on this file or this file, this pawn is isolated, and that's known to be somewhat of a weakness. So that's an example of a trade-off in chess. You're giving up your strongest central pawn in order to land white with this potential weakness. Black continues with knight to b6, attacking this bishop. So he's violated the opening principle that says don't move the same piece twice in the opening. You know, this knight moved to here and then it moved to here. But white's going to have to also move a piece twice in the opening unless he wants to allow black to get the knight for bishop trade. So if you just defended the bishop, knight takes c4, queen takes c4. It's true that maybe black has fallen a little bit behind in getting the pieces activated, but he's achieved a favorable exchange since bishops are known to be slightly more valuable than knights. He's traded off his knight for white's bishop. So white doesn't want to allow that and just drops the bishop back. Now the knight moves a third time. However, it's jumped to the center of the board. And this move comes with an attack on the other bishop. If white were to take this knight out with a knight, it would just be replaced with the other knight, still attacking a bishop. So instead, white chooses to move the bishop here, giving up central control, but we're attacking a piece that is controlling the center. So that's sort of an indirect control of the center. Black develops his bishop to d7. Now white moves the same piece twice in the opening, but similarly to what black did, it comes with an attack on a bishop. Here black just ignores that and moves this rook to an open file. There's no pawns on this file, so that's a good place to put the rook. White does the same. White chooses not to trade the knight for the bishop because this knight is in an ideal location, sitting in the center of the board. This bishop is not black's best piece. It can't do anything along this diagonal because it's blocked by black's own pawn. And if it moves anywhere out this way, white will always have the option to capture it with a knight. So white puts his rook to the open file. The bishop moves here, increasing central control. The bishop's controlling the center, and now the queen again has a view of the center. White now develops his last piece, moving the queen to e2. The rooks are connected. White's development is completed. All black has left to do is move his queen off of its original square, and his development will be completed as well. So that is an example of an opening where both players are fighting to position their pieces most ideally, giving up some advantages to gain others. As you can see, there are many different factors to think about in the opening. You might trade one advantage to get a different advantage, like where black gave up his central pawn to weaken white's pawn structure a little bit. And as you get better at chess, you will learn to recognize these different sorts of trade-offs, which ones are advantageous, which ones are not. It just takes experience. Now I'm going to give you just a couple quick examples of what can happen when a player neglects certain opening principles. So first we'll look at central control. In these examples, black is not going to contest white's control of the center with the pawns, and instead is just going to try to develop pieces. So white plays e4, black responds knight c6, allowing white to get the ideal pawn setup. Black plays g6, looking to develop the bishop here, but now d5 comes with an attack on the knight. If the knight moves to this e5 square, then f4 would win the knight. The knight has no safe square where it can go. If it goes here, the queen's going to take it out. If it moves over here, the pawn's going to take it out. There's nowhere it can go. This is common in the opening when you're playing against beginners. They'll get their knights into these situations, so watch for that. So instead of knight to e5, black moves the knight to b4, and then white attacks it again, and its only safe square is now to move to a6. White plays queen to d4, attacking the rook. Black blocks with knight to f6, and now white expands even further with his pawns attacking the knight on f6, which goes to h5. Now white has some good central control. It's okay that the queen's out a little early, the queen cannot be attacked. White is dominating in the center. The knight is developed to its ideal square. Now black would like to develop the bishop like this and get ready to castle, but here g4 wins a piece because this knight has nowhere to go. Anywhere it goes, it can be captured. So black cannot play that move, instead plays this b6 move looking to develop this bishop. Bishop c4 played by white, more central control. Bishop to b7, developing a bishop. Knight goes to its ideal square, e6 is played by black. Finally attacking a central square only because this bishop needs to be developed. It's a little too late. White captures the knight, bishop recaptures, g4, attacking the knight, which drops back to its only safe square, g7. Now we have knight e4. Jumping into the center, black tries to develop the bishop, but unfortunately white has this move d6, attacking the bishop. The pawn can be taken, but it's replaced with a pawn. Bishop's still under attack. If it moves anywhere out this way, white is going to win a piece, so it drops back to f8, but this is even worse because now knight to f6 check, and black's only legal move is to capture the knight with the queen because the king has nowhere to go, and so loses the queen. Now here's an example of what happens when black neglects the castle. He does everything else right, but he leaves his king in the center. So we have this very typical opening. This is the Ruy Lopez opening. And now we have bishop c5 by black. White plays c3, preparing to put a pawn on d4. The c3 pawn's going to support that. Black plays b5, attacking the bishop, which just drops back. Black plays d5, striking in the center. Pawn takes pawn. Knight takes pawn. d4 is played. Black takes, without worrying that there is now an open file to his king. So white does not recapture. White checks the black king. Now if you move the king, you lose the right to castle forever. So black chooses to put a piece in the way instead, but white immediately attacks that piece, which is pinned. That bishop cannot move or black will be in check. Black's not worried about it, simply develops the queen. The knight takes on e6. Now the queen cannot take, or the rook will capture the queen, so the only other option is pawn takes, and now white gets queen h5 check. This is a situation where it's good to get your queen out before some of your other pieces, because white's threats to the vulnerable uncastled black king make it worth it. Now here black should move his king, which will forfeit his right to castle, but instead he makes a mistake. He tries to block the check with this move g6, which is a blunder. Maybe you can spot white's winning move here. I'll give you a hint. It has to do with the fact that this pawn is pinned. So it's able to move forward, but it's not able to make any captures. White's winning move here is queen takes d5. That knight on d5 did not have adequate protection, because after the queen takes the queen, the bishop can take the queen. And as I said, this pawn is not available to capture the bishop, or the king will be in check. So that's a nice example of the kinds of tactics you might find if your opponent fails to castle. So that concludes my openings lesson for beginners. Let me know if this video was helpful to you. Consider subscribing to the channel for more chess-related videos coming your way soon.